I'm pleased with the film as a whole. I think I'm fairly happy with what I do, but the film as a whole, I think, is another Oshima masterpiece. It's a classic movie. It's wonderful. I much went for it, not even knowing what the story was about, only because of Oshima's name himself as a number one or number two Japanese director. I mean, it's a privilege to be asked to do something with him. And I was even more eager when I read the book.
Yes, I have a couple of questions for Mr. David Bowie. First of all, how was it working with Mr. Oshima in this film for the first time?
Oshima-san is quite definitely the very best dressed director I've ever worked with. Other than that, he gave me one of the most fulfilling experiences of my working career in either film or writing or making records. I think it was, for me, a novice actor in terms of film and stage. I think it required of me to summon up a lot of my own life's experiences, which I found quite grueling for the first few weeks until I could learn to apply them to the character that I was playing. I've never played anything so unstylized before. I think that's what made it so rewarding for me. From the Western point of view, I've given a tremendous amount of help by both Jack Thompson and Tom Conti, who unfortunately isn't here today, but really should, because his performance, I think, is quite remarkable in the film. I think that there was always a common ground in terms of, I tend to believe that Oshima makes, his films are not an impression, they're an expression of an idea. And my writing has always been in terms of expression rather than impression. So I felt there was some kind of overlap in our working methods. So I felt that we possibly understood each other far better than I've, in fact, understood some Western directors.
He would sketch out the idea of a scene and give us some basic ideas for lines taken from Paul Mansberg's script, and then allow us, the actors, to throw our ideas backwards and forwards. And just at the point where we thought we were getting somewhere, he would stop and say, right, now we go. And he would film it, and so one sort of thrown into the scene. I enjoyed working like that. I haven't worked like that before in film. There was no facility for having any rushes on the island. So the stuff would be wrapped up in brown paper and sent off to Tokyo, not knowing whether it was going to be good or bad or whatever. And he never saw any rushes during the entire filming. Yet within 4 days of getting back to Tokyo, he'd got a rough edit finished.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Frightening. And we only did maybe 2 takes average, and often 1 take, very rarely more than 2 takes. I'm a behaviourist. I mean, I'm much more, I do everything just by instinct. He's got such a wonderful analytical mind about how characters should work and how they interplay with each other. And I can't work like that. I just have to not know what I'm going to do and then just sort of do it and hope it comes out all right. Do work hard at acting, but the reason for that, I think, is that it's so hard for somebody in music to jump over and do movies. The idea of them being a rock musician is always at the front of the audience's mind, and it's very hard to. You've got to fight twice as hard and try and work twice as well as you would do if one was just a struggling actor. That's not fair. I know most struggling actors work really hard as well, but one feels as though there's another wall to break down. On violence being a part of the spirit that must be built in the Japanese culture. It's not as apparent in the Western. We just like to go and fight because we want to steal countries or steal something another country's got. But it's not quite that way in the East. It's part of being. Violence is, as much as love-making, is quite as important. It should be worked on as hard as love-making. It's quite odd. I'm not comfortable with it at all, that kind of violence. You see a lot of these, some of the karate-trained guys that were working on the film, there was an overpowering charisma of violence about them. Not on the, I mean, off the set. And one always felt very tentative about getting too close to them or talking to them, or at least talking to them about anything that might be considered intimate. Because I know they're not very straight, but they're the only ones I've got.
What's the essential difference in David Bowie now compared to David Bowie 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
The hairstyle, I think. I don't think there's really that much difference in terms of the work. I think my general attitude has probably changed a lot. It's become that of a 36-year-old, but as far as work goes, I think I'm still very curious and still take quite a few risks, I suppose. I'm still a curiosity seeker, looking at the idiosyncrasies of things.
I believe you've said that you're essentially a solitary person, almost the outsider to society. Why do you feel that way?
I'm more comfortable, I think. I'm more comfortable being on the outside, observing things. It hasn't been like that on this tour, I must say. The great bunch of guys I've been working with, I feel quite a social animal at the moment, but no doubt I'll go back into my retreat when I finish the tour. I don't know.
It's a compulsion that leads you to explore that leading edge all the time? Yeah.
And I get that probably the best work and my best feelings are when I'm traveling more than anything else. I can't seem to produce very much in the way of interesting work when I'm on the road in America, for instance. I find that very hard because there's a certain uniformity of city and expression and cultural stagnation in the cities in America that I can't really produce anything much. Maybe I'm just not switched into the American way of thinking. My imagination goes berserk if I'm in the Far East or Thailand or somewhere like that. And it doesn't mean that the work will only be about Thailand, but it sort of frees me up a lot more. Or a Berlin or somewhere like that. But it's hard to write in Akron. It's kind of, I feel a bit stifled there.
What was the genesis of the concept for this show, for this David Bowie world tour?
I think I wanted more than anything else to, again, put the stage environment into a place that one couldn't actually pin down. So I just juxtaposed the idea of high-tech columns against kind of a 50s Singapore look. Because often the juxtaposition of two opposites produce a third kind of statement. And I think it worked very successfully for this show. You can't really put your finger on it. Having just seen Blade Runner the other day, I was intrigued the way Ridley Scott did almost the same kind of thing. I see there's a huge element of Chinatown in his 21st century city. I found that intriguing because that's exactly the way I felt that would produce this. You could identify it, but it was slightly foreign to one. And it's a very light-hearted show compared to some of my previous things. So a certain amount of humor in it, a lot of humor in it.
Does that represent a certain attitude towards life?
It just meant I didn't want to do a serious show. When I do a serious show, it gets analysed to death. I mean, it just becomes... and I don't agree with everything that's said about the serious shows.
A little while ago, you said that you wanted to make a lighthearted show, yet you called it Serious Moonlight. And that phrase, I think, has puzzled a great many people.
It's an Americanism that I just like. Serious this and serious that. I thought, right, this is going to be a romantic tour, so we'll call it Serious Moonlight Tour, you know. Just had no great meaning behind it.
You conceived the show as well as for stage, then for television at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. It was essential for me, anyway, to, with prior knowledge that I'd be using diamond vision screens, that are very large screens that are used in stadiums, that something actually happened on the screen other than just a bland kind of presentation of a band. And it was also, I mean, I couldn't resist it anyway, to sort of design something that worked for stage and for TV screens. It's a precarious balance, and I think it's just a rudimentary idea. I mean, next time around it'll probably be better. But because I've learned a lot just doing this tour about what works and what doesn't work on either side. But that was fascinating, trying to put the two mediums together, try and make them work both at the same time.
I think, as usual, you've done it very well, Mr.
The actual working process did. After the first couple of months working on it, I found that I'd been trying to create the same character every night, but after a few months, that was starting to stagnate. It felt really hard to kind of reproduce him the same way every night, so I became a lot more free around my interpretation of him. I didn't really buy the line that he was that sort of, that saintly. I mean, I found something quite, I would have imagined being a Londoner that there would have been a certain kind of sardonic quality about all these people suddenly looking up to him. And I think he would feel very happy with the position he was suddenly put. There were a lot of freaks in London at that time, so-called freaks. And he was just suddenly plucked out of them, and he must have thought, this is great. You know, this is fantastic. Look at that, you know, they're getting food, and all these people are, you know. There would be an element of that in him, so he was a bit sort of, kind of played around with his position a lot.
Detecting a kind of hypocrisy in the attitude.
Yeah. I think so my interpretation was possibly more humorous than some of the others. And I thought in visual terms that I would take that desperation to its logical conclusion, which in the desperation of dance is a society trying to manifest its innermost feelings through dance. And I thought that visually the idea of finding a tribe and a country that hadn't been seen that much, like Australia, and taking the tribe out of its tribal gear, and because the Aborigines in Australia, that's where I filmed the thing, no longer want to be considered the last cavemen of the world. I mean, that's the last thing they want. The young Aborigines want to be part of the Australian society, and it's very hard for them to be able to become part of that society. And one very rarely sees them in blue jeans and work shirts, which is how they are and what they wear. And the look of the country is so kind of alien that it represented, in fact, any state where that kind of situation exists. Any third world state, a lot of our Western capitals, but it's not identifiable with any particular city or country, so it was a good kind of slightly surrealist kind of vision, really.
What leads you, though, at this stage of your life into that kind of universal statement?
I think having the being able to make these 3.5-minute movies, and they're repeated all over the world. They're shown all the time all over the world. It just seems like a great waste just to make them as promos for a new song. It should be able to say something as well. The amount of repetition of these things, shown so many times, they might as well say something with them. It's just as much work to try and sell the song as to try and sell a statement, so it's no more work, really.